While On the Beach depicts a city wilting beneath the tide of foreign threats, the Melbourne represented in Mad Max is very much a vision of domestic breakdown. George Miller's use of, quote, rundown urban spaces, rolling freeways, and rural retreats suggests a societal decline that echoes the protagonist's own descent into barbarism. Like Kramer, Miller's mise-en-scène contradicts traditional cinematic dystopias, which tend to emphasize nightmarish urban prisons oppressed by invasive technologies, towering skyscrapers, and perpetual rain and night, for example, as seen in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. Miller has instead elected to present a more stripped-down Melbourne aesthetic, focusing on the decay and collapse of Melbourne several years into the future. For example, the letterhead over the Halls of Justice building has begun to rust and sink, while untrimmed vines creep up and around its archway. The film's use of pastoral imagery and vast blue skies, in contrast to the rolling black storm clouds of biblical apocalypse, is jarring. It suggests the reassertion of nature's authority and a reclaiming of the environment that the city of Melbourne has intruded upon for far too long. Rather than nourishing a sense of freedom in the viewer's mind, a horizon ripe for adventure, the still fields and paddocks that stretch away from the city limits assume an ancient existential quality, utterly indifferent to the fates or longevity of their fleeting human occupants. There is a sense of finality to the world Max Rokitansky inhabits, a notion that human beings and human civilization has passed the point of its decadence and is slowly crumbling back towards a more primal, animalistic state. The border between city and country thus comes to represent the line between the ordered, civilized spaces within and the lawless, chaotic, amoral void beyond. There are those who embrace this void, such as the toe cutter, whose motorcycle gang has abandoned the city and now prowl its bordering highways like some post-industrial hunting ground. Then there are those who defend the city, who still cling to the conceptual frameworks that gave meaning to the old world, such as family, mateship, justice, and honor, like Max. Miller creates a similar experience of estrangement for viewers by using locations that are ostensibly familiar, almost banal, to Melbourne and Victorian locals, but imposing upon them strange phenomena, such as spiked, leather-clad outlaws, and shocking ruptures of violence. Through this use of uncanny imagery, Miller is able to connect this, quote, horrific and fantastical vision of Melbourne with its real-world counterpart. For example, the opening sequence of the film was shot on Cherry Lane in the North Melbourne suburb of Laverton. The carnage begins on a desolate highway, Koroit Creek Road, with a car chase between the main force patrol and the psychotic Night Rider, before gradually receding into the outskirts of the city with the chilling dispatch, quote, Christ, he's heading for population. The action veers off an exit ramp, at which point the flat horizon is suddenly broken by industrial towers and the carnage of the road spills into suburbia. One by one, symbols of civilization, such as a telephone box, a touring caravan, and police cars, are destroyed in the process of this battle, embodying the chaotic tension that simmers between the police and the gangs. It is important to note that while Melbourne lies at the center of this emerging dystopia, it is also a refuge away from it, and the living but dying shell of civilization, the last city standing, so to speak. But how much longer will it stand is the question on every character's mind, as the main force patrol forfeit more and more of the highways to the gangs and struggle to keep the violence away from the outer suburbs. The headquarters of the main force patrol, called the Halls of Justice, is the Spotswood Melbourne and Metropolitan Board of Works pumping station. Perhaps the old brick building, with its towering chimneys, gave the police station the sturdy resolve that Miller was looking for. However, it is also a tragic irony that Melbourne's law enforcement body has been reduced to operating out of a sewerage station, their raison d'etre circling the drain, as it were. The building, which was constructed in the 1890s, also implies a sense of obsolescence and decrepitness, as though it were, like the law, a relic from a forgotten world. Like the plumbing station, the factories around Laverton look empty and abandoned. The entire film labors under this post-industrial aesthetic. We learn in the sequel, Mad Max 2: The Road Warrior, that this present breakdown was brought about by the drying up of oil reserves. As the narrator laments, "Without fuel, they were nothing. They'd built a house of straw. The thundering machines sputtered and stopped." This eventuality is foreshadowed in the original film, Mad Max, when Max's car is referenced as one of the last V8s ever manufactured in Australia. Once again, this emphasizes the notion that human civilization has already reached some apex of industrialization, and that our contemporary society, in this case 1970s Melbourne, is experiencing a long and gradual entropy, one that we may not comprehend in the immediate reality, but that our subconscious is able to perceive with numbing dread. Perhaps the Knight Rider puts it best with his final words, "It's going, it's all going, there'll be nothing, it's gone," as he drives headfirst into his fiery demise. This moment of suicidal enlightenment foreshadows Max's own realization about the state and fate of humanity. Initially, Max is connected to the city through his relationship with his wife, child, and best friend and fellow policeman, Goose, each of whom gives meaning to his life and live within the morally ordered, rational borders of urbanity. However, the more violence Max is exposed to on the highways, the less psychologically stable he becomes. He admits to his commanding officer that he is beginning to enjoy his bloody vehicular clashes with the gangs, and that he is becoming increasingly like them, slipping further and further into the amoral void that their asphalt-scarred landscape evokes. The emotional anchor provided by Goose is eventually ripped away from him, and as each person in Max's life is brutally and pointlessly murdered by outlaws, Max becomes, quote, detached from society, modern order, and the physical world. He abandons his post as defender of the city and gives himself over to the barbaric war of the Outer Territories. One of Miller's chief inspirations for this dystopian vision was Melbourne's youth car culture of the 1970s, and the weekly deaths and mutilations this culture facilitated. Having worked in a city hospital for a short time, the director developed a, quote, morbid fascination with the autocide practice within our society, end quote, and moreover, the sustained indifference with which the average citizen has come to regard road death statistics. While government broadcasts implore citizens to drive safely, it became routine for Melbourne drivers, at least during the 1970s, to speed, ignore seatbelts, and consume alcohol while driving. It is almost as though Melburnians accepted that a certain number of people, whether drivers, passengers, or pedestrians, would inevitably be sacrificed to the roads, which take on the characteristics of a killing field. This imbues the urban automobile with an aura of death, which Miller reconfigures in the form of Mad Max's psychotic antagonists. This blend of death and the everyday, as well as sex, given the somatic pleasure the gangs gain from crashing into one another and penetrating their vehicular prey with chains and poles, is the mark of a deeply unhealthy and dystopian society. Despite their similar representations of Melbourne as a last city standing, one of the key differences between On the Beach and Mad Max is the city dweller's association with nature. Kramer depicts his characters as coming to reject the rigidity and artifice of the city, gradually drifting back to pastoral dwellings and seeking to reconnect with nature and rural community through the activities of fishing, picnicking, horseback riding, and folk singing. Conversely, Miller expresses a deep ambivalence towards the natural world, linking it with primordial human behaviors and characterizing the non-urban world as lawless, amoral, and menacing. One of the recurring themes in Australian apocalyptic narratives is the sense that the land is hostile towards European intruders because of their history of violence against its flora, fauna, and indigenous people. This sense of hostility is very apparent in the scene where Max's wife sunbakes on a beach during their vacation and is symbolically assaulted by the bordering forest as she makes her way back to the house. The scene, in which the woman is confronted by scratching tree branches, territorial birds, and possum corpses, suggests that the world beyond the urban and suburban dwellings is a strange, unresolved place which is rarely ventured into. The vision of an Australian apocalypse relates to the overriding modern dread that our great cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, are temporal landmarks, soon to be swept away by the righteous wrath of nature and reclaimed by the incomprehensible lands beyond. Furthermore, Mad Max suggests that humanity's imminent and inevitable extinction might not be such a negative result after all. From the audience's perspective, the imagery of human activity throughout the film is akin to a plague of metal-bound locusts, devouring one another and generally just wreaking havoc. The further away the camera shifts from the action, for example as a car is receding into the distance, the more insignificant we are made to feel, especially within the context of a much older and larger environment. This anxiety could apply to all humans, but it is especially relevant to Australians, given how young, even infantile, our society is, even within the relatively modern era of colonial history. Melbourne has existed as a city for less than 2 centuries, and before that, not a single skyscraper, shopping centre, pub, or house dwelt upon its soil. Its former occupants were nomadic Indigenous peoples who sought to live in harmony with the land rather than dominate it. By comparison, Melbourne feels like a tract of Victorian architecture that has been transplanted from London to the far side of the world. The city was originally a British settlement, residing in a place where it was not natively conceived, nor necessarily welcome. Perhaps a sense of guilt even lingers within the Australian subconscious, regarding the way the Indigenous peoples have been dislocated in such a vicious and unreconciled fashion, and that the environment itself, which was once so sacred, has been paved over with asphalt roads which crisscross the land like ugly black scars. Of course, the dualistic fear is that these concrete manifestations of human civilization, the roads and buildings we have spent our lives cultivating, are merely a thin, insignificant layer of real estate resting upon a chillingly vast and millennia-old ecosystem, which, sooner or later, will shake us off its back like a bad case of the flu. Apocalyptic and dystopian narratives are important because they alter our perception and force us to, quote, see the world, our lives, our blinding reality with new eyes. Directors Kramer and Miller extrapolate from reality, creating an alternate Melbourne that could credibly exist. Thus, the physical destruction of this speculative place is a metaphorical and conceptual destruction of the actual Melbourne. The question on viewers' minds is, if this recognizable version of Melbourne could be destroyed by nuclear fallout or petroleum depletion, by institutional collapse or epidemic crime, then how stable is the Melbourne that we inhabit at this very moment? What complacent attitudes or poor decisions separate our present from that future? The true terror, these films suggest, is that Melbourne lacks any capacity to prevent the apocalypse. Its speculative role as the last city standing is purely a function of its geopolitical insignificance. As a metaphor for human civilization, as depicted in On the Beach and Mad Max, Melbourne is merely the dying embers of a once roaring fire.